Hello again. This is our third section for lessons purposes, and this, what I'll call lecturette, will deal with two things. First, it's going to deal with different perceptions of ethics, or two different approaches, and we're going to take the sociological approach and compare it with the philosophical approach to ethics. And I'm going to do so just to make it clear that we're taking a philosophical approach to ethics here. And we're also going to answer a quick little challenge of the sociological approach. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to deal with the is-ought distinction. And that's going to be important to what we do. But before we do that, let's deal with the sociological perspective of ethics versus the philosophical version of ethics. The sociological version of ethics seems to take what they would consider a scientific approach. Now, by science, most advocates of this seem to believe that something is science if it is verified empirically or able to be verified empirically. Now, what do I mean by empirical verification? Well, I had already discussed this in the little handouts I gave you, but to say it now, I will say that science relies on the empirical verification inasmuch as it relies on justification for beliefs based on the five senses: seeing, touching, tasting, hearing, and smelling. So if somehow you can test something through the five senses, it is scientific. Okay, that's the empirical verificationist method. There's much more to it, but it is always through the five senses. Now, sociologists, being part of the social sciences, want to rest their methodologies on science, which is verified through the five senses. So when sociologists when they approach ethics, they do so from this empiricistic, verificationistic theory of methodology. Now, what they're going to say is, well, then what we're going to do is we're going to take morals and we're going to try to perceive them through the five senses. Well, one cannot perceive morality such as good and evil through the five senses, but what you can perceive through the five senses are behaviors. You could take surveys and find out what people say they believe. You could look at their cultural norms, the things they do, and the way they act, the crimes they prosecute, or the things they allow, or the actions they accept or reject. And we could take all that in through the five senses. But that does not say whether we should accept certain cultures or not. So what we get is a descriptive account of what cultures and people do, say, believe, and how they act. So you get a very descriptive account of things. But what you do not get is a prescriptive thing. Now, what I want to do is read from the dictionary, the Oxford Dictionary of Sociology, in having to do with morality. So I shall read from it and you will hear what it says. Ethics, a branch of philosophy concerned with moral principles and values, with what ought to be the case and how people ought to live their lives. Ethical philosophers are concerned with ideas of good and bad as they apply to human affairs. Ethics is contrasted with science, which is concerned with describing reality as it actually exists. This distinction has given rise to the notion that social science should be value-free or value-neutral. In practice, however, both means and goals of social science investigation are intrinsically bound up with ethical considerations. Much ethical philosophy has sought to discover absolute foundations for moral judgments, but most recent work holds that this is impossible. Contemporary ethical thought, therefore, tends to adopt a standpoint of relativism. Now, there are a few things I want to say about this. First, you notice how they make a distinction between ethics and reality. They suggest that science deals with reality and ethical treatment is something else that we can't reach. That is, because we can't sense it through the five senses, that is, through science, it must not be real. Now, I'm going to reject that. First, I'm going to reject it because to make that claim is not scientific. Because we can't test the truth of that claim, that all truth must come through the five senses. You can't test that through the five senses. How would you do so? Therefore, it fails its own test. It's not scientific. So science is not the only way to know truth. And it's not the only way to know reality, or if it's real, it doesn't necessarily have to fall within the purview of science. That's not a scientific claim. Or science cannot make that claim or show that claim to be true. Therefore, it's false. Now, the other claim that because of this we should adopt a view of say, relativism. Relativism suggests that there is no real truth, and that just moral reality is nothing more than a descriptive terms of how one culture acts in relation to another culture. It doesn't say that one culture is better than the other. It just says that they are different. Now, this gives rise to the is-ought distinction. See, social sciences, as described here, can only describe what is. They could only describe, say, what a culture does. They could describe what a culture believes. They could describe how cultures act and how they enforce certain laws and allow certain practices. For example, let's take Eskimos. It has been said that many Eskimo tribes allow other men to sleep with their wives as a courtesy. Well, in America, we're a totally different culture. We don't believe that to be ethical. In fact, we reject that. We'd say that is morally wrong. Now, the social scientist is not going to say that there is any real immorality taking place or any moral behavior taking place in America. They're merely going to say there are two different sets of beliefs and two different sets of actions, that there really is no grand overarching moral principle to which we could judge one culture over the other. All we can do scientifically is describe the similarities and differences. The is-ought distinction makes a distinction of what is the case, the description, and what it ought to be. Now, the real question here is there an ought? Is there a way one should act? Now, the philosopher is going to make the claim that really there is, or many philosophers are. Many are going to embrace a relativistic account of things, but many philosophers, as you will see, reject the notion of relativism and suggest that no, there is a true standard by which men and culture should exist and live their lives. And thus, the is-ought distinction makes a distinction between what is the case and what ought to be the case. And I want us to not confuse this, because many of our papers, as I've already seen, and it's nothing new, it's common at this point in the course, but many of the courses, the papers I should say, suggest that morality is nothing more than our cultural norms. Well, what if our cultural norms just happen to be raping, pillaging, and plundering, or slavery, or some kind of really horrendous act? Well, that may be our cultural norm, but that does nothing to say whether it's good or bad. So what we want to do is be able to look at our cultural norms and ask, is this the way things ought to be? And on what grounds do we decide that? So the is-ought distinction, and this is what I want you to know, is that the is-ought distinction makes a distinction between what is the case and what ought to be the case. That is, we can describe the facts of this, but then we can evaluate whether or not this situation should be that way. Now, there'll be several pictures that I want you to look at, and you could describe these pictures. You could see a picture here of a black man hanging, and you could describe him as probably a young black man. There's a rope. You could describe the rope. It's long. He's dead. You can make all sorts of descriptions, descriptive statements about it. But what you need to be able to do is ask yourself the question, should this be the case? Now, all of the descriptors such as young, black, male, tree, rope, all the things that you would describe the picture in the description in the picture, they have no moral quality to them. We could look at another picture and say we could look at these children here who are skinny, pale, gaunt. They look young, and we could tell that they are malnourished. And if we knew the context of it, we could say that these are children in a Nazi concentration camp who are being tested on by Nazi physicians to see how long the body can last while being starved. But the picture and the actions themselves, if we take a social science view, we cannot say that this is a good or evil act. As a matter of fact, to the Nazis, this was a perfectly good act. They certainly accepted it as their moral norm to take another race and treat them as guinea pigs. In America, we saw this as an abomination and something worthy of going to war over. Now, how does the social scientist deal with them? Can the social scientist say that we should have gone to war? Can the social scientist say that this is a moral atrocity? No, what the social scientist could say is the Germans believed this and the Americans believed that. They can only describe what is the case. They fail to suggest what ought to be the case. We could take Hermann Gosnell and we could look at these pictures of the spine snipped of the fetuses or babies, whatever you want to call it. It is what it is. And you can say, well, what I see here is what looks to be a human. It has this certain shape, it has this certain size. We can scientifically describe it genetically, that its DNA is X, Y, and chromosomes or whatnot. And we could say that there's an incision in the back of the neck, that it appears to be dead. The question here is that the scientists can't answer is, should it be dead? Should Dr. Gosnell have done this? We could describe what is the case, or we could ask what ought to be the case. In the scientific inquiry, all we could do is ask the question, what is the case? We can never make ought statements with this. We'll call these prescriptive statements. One, you have descriptive statements, and then on the other hand you have prescriptive statements. We want to be able to prescribe what ought to be the case, not necessarily just what is the case. We want to look at what is the case and say, should it actually be here? Now, I've been very long-winded about this, and I've shown you some pictures, but hopefully it drives home the idea that there is a difference between what is and what ought to be. And I want us to be able to make that distinction. So, without further ado, what I'd like you to be able to do now is take time, and this is your assignment, is to write a couple paragraphs describing one of the pictures you saw in this video, and just put down descriptions. And then I want you to ask yourself, if you could make a should or an ought statement about these. And if so, did you get this ought statement from merely the descriptors, or does it have to come from somewhere else? So I want you to describe the picture and ask, should this be the case? And then if you say it should not or it should be, I want you to tell me where you got that from. All right? If you have any problems with that, just rewind it, see if you could get me to repeat myself as many times as it takes for you to understand the assignment. I look forward to your work, and until then, have a good day.